In the final months of the war, when the skies above Europe were crowded with the smoke of burning cities and falling aircraft, one German pilot made a mistake that would change everything. His name was Heinrich Rosener, a 24-year-old Luftwaffe test pilot stationed near Bremen, assigned to a jet so secret that most of Germany's air force didn't even know it existed. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was Hitler's last hope to regain air superiority. But on that cold morning in March 1945, Rosener's compass flickered, his fuel gauge dropped faster than expected, and the radio crackled with static. He had taken off for a simple transfer flight to deliver the prototype to another base for testing. Yet within minutes, clouds rolled in thick as fog, the landmarks vanished, and the map on his lap became useless. The sky turned from gray to featureless white, and Rosener realized he might have overshot the planned route. Below him, he saw a long runway, freshly paved and lined with aircraft. Thinking it was a friendly German airfield, he dropped altitude, lowered his landing gear, and touched down. The moment his wheels hit the tarmac, soldiers ran toward him, but their uniforms were not gray. They were olive green, and their helmets were American. Before he could reach for his sidearm, the cockpit was surrounded. Machine guns pointed at him. The young pilot froze, eyes wide, realizing the impossible. He had landed in enemy territory. The Americans could not believe what they were seeing. A sleek jet unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was faster, smoother, and completely alien to their eyes. Engineers who rushed to the scene thought it might be some kind of experimental rocket plane. Only after careful inspection did they discover the truth. The Germans had built a jet that could outrun anything in the Allied arsenal. Rosener's mistake had handed the Allies not just a secret, but a glimpse into the future of aviation itself. Within hours, the captured Me-262 was crated, labeled under the highest classification, and shipped across the Atlantic. In that single landing, without firing a bullet, one disoriented pilot had changed the technological balance of the war. The jet was still warm when American engineers surrounded it under the morning sun, whispering as if they were looking at something from another world. The shape was unlike any Allied fighter. Sleek swept wings, twin engines mounted under them, and a nose shaped like a bullet. Every rivet, every curve looked purposeful, terrifyingly efficient. The men who had worked on the P-51 and the P-47 stared at it like mechanics from the Stone Age staring at a spaceship. When the canopy was opened, they saw controls labeled in German, oxygen tubes neatly arranged, and instruments calibrated far beyond anything they had used. The captured pilot, Heinrich Rosener, sat in a wooden chair nearby, his wrists loosely tied. He was pale, exhausted, and silent. He knew what he had done. Across the field, American officers debated whether to fly the aircraft or disassemble it. It looked so advanced that even the most experienced test pilots hesitated. Finally, one of them said, "If this thing works, the war in the air could have gone very differently." They towed the jet into a hangar, guarded by armed soldiers. Within hours, teams from Wright Field, Ohio, arrived, engineers, technicians, and intelligence officers specializing in captured enemy technology. For them, this was the discovery of the decade. They called the aircraft Black Lightning. As they peeled back panels and examined the engines, they realized Germany had jumped a generation ahead. The Me-262's turbojet engines could push it past 500 miles per hour, faster than any propeller-driven aircraft could dream of. It was not just fast, it was years ahead of its time. When they tested the alloy composition, they found metals engineered to withstand extreme heat, something no American plant had yet mastered. Each part told a story of desperate innovation born under bombing raids and collapsing cities. The engineers knew that if this jet had entered combat in large numbers, Allied bombers would have been torn apart. But fate, arrogance, and chaos had stopped that from happening. Hitler had insisted that the jet be turned into a bomber instead of a fighter, wasting precious time in production. Now, the result of that mismanagement was sitting quietly in an American hangar, its creator unknowingly handing it over. That night, Rosener finally spoke. His first words were quiet, almost calm. "I thought I was landing in Bremen." The officer in charge looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Son, you landed in the United States." The pilot lowered his head, and in that moment, he realized he had just delivered Hitler's secret weapon straight into enemy hands. Within days, the captured jet was loaded onto a C-54 transport aircraft and flown across the Atlantic under a shroud of secrecy. Every crate was marked with fake serial numbers, and only a handful of officers knew what it contained. When it arrived at Wright Field in Ohio, the crates were opened under armed guard. The jet gleamed under the hangar lights like a ghost from the future. American engineers swarmed it with notebooks, calipers, and cameras, documenting every rivet and wire. The first thing that stunned them was how compact the engines were. They were Junkers Jumo 004S, Germany's first operational turbojets. They used axial compressors, a design far more advanced than anything the Allies had built. The Americans were still experimenting with bulky centrifugal engines, and the efficiency difference was enormous. One engineer muttered, "This is what the future looks like." When they powered it up for the first time, the roar filled the hangar like thunder. Flames spat from the exhaust, the ground vibrated, and the smell of burning kerosene filled the air. For a moment, they believed it might explode. But it held steady, the turbines whining at a pitch none of them had ever heard before. The aircraft wasn't just fast. It was intelligent in design. The swept wings reduced drag at high speed, the tricycle gear allowed smoother landings, and even the guns were positioned to minimize recoil interference. Every inch of it told a story of engineers who were fighting against time, building machines that shouldn't have existed yet. Intelligence officers began piecing together reports from Europe. They learned that the Me-262 had entered limited service months earlier and had already downed Allied bombers at alarming speeds. Pilots described attacks so sudden that radar operators couldn't react. The enemy seemed to appear, fire, and vanish within seconds. And now, one of those jets was sitting quietly on American soil, intact, ready to reveal its secrets. Teams began to reverse engineer the engines, measuring blade angles, turbine spacing, and fuel flow rates. Within weeks, sketches turned into prototypes. What they were learning would later inspire engines that powered the next generation of American aircraft. While the war still raged overseas in this quiet Ohio hangar, the foundation of post-war air dominance was being born. What no one realized yet was that the pilot's mistake had done more than deliver a single jet. It had opened a door to the jet age, years ahead of schedule. And for the young German who had landed it, history would never forget the day his error changed the skies forever. When word reached Washington about the captured jet, a quiet panic rippled through the military's upper ranks. Only a few officers saw the photographs, but those who did instantly understood what it meant. Germany had achieved something the Allies had only dreamed of: a true jet-powered combat aircraft capable of outrunning and outclimbing anything in existence. Orders were sent to keep the discovery under absolute secrecy. No public mention, no photographs, no reports. The aircraft was quietly renamed in documents as Evaluation Unit X. Behind the closed doors of Wright Field, American test pilots were preparing for something that had never been done before: flying an enemy jet. Captain Fred Watson, one of the Army Air Force's most skilled test pilots, volunteered. He studied the translated manuals, though many notes were incomplete or guessed at. When the day came, he climbed into the unfamiliar cockpit, surrounded by German labels and instruments that ticked in metric readings. Technicians fueled the engines with trembling hands. When Watson pressed the start button, the turbines whined like screaming metal ghosts. The ground shook. Slowly, the Me-262 rolled forward, then thundered down the runway and lifted off. Everyone on the ground froze in disbelief. The jet climbed effortlessly, slicing through the air with a sound that didn't belong to the era of propellers. For 10 minutes, the future of flight soared over Ohio. Watson later wrote that it felt like piloting a lightning bolt. The controls were smooth, the response instant, the acceleration breathtaking. But there was danger too. The jet engines were fragile, prone to overheating or flameouts if handled roughly. Landing it was a test of nerves. When the wheels finally touched down, the hangar erupted in cheers. The test was a success, and the implications were enormous. Within weeks, American designers were tearing apart their blueprints, sketching new aircraft inspired by the Me-262's design. Bell, Lockheed, and North American engineers studied its curves and systems, and from its DNA would come the first American jets, the P-80 Shooting Star and the F-86 Sabre. What had started as one German pilot's navigation error was now reshaping the future of aviation itself. Across the ocean, the Luftwaffe was collapsing, unaware that its most advanced weapon had already begun fueling its enemy's next leap forward. By the time the war ended, the United States held not only victory but the blueprint of the jet age, all thanks to a single flight that had gone disastrously right for the wrong side. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the skies over Europe were silent except for the sound of Allied patrols. The once mighty Luftwaffe was gone, and its factories stood in ruins. But deep inside American research bases, the work born from Heinrich Rosener's mistake was only beginning. Engineers who had studied the Me-262 were now leading a new generation of jet projects. Every curve of its wing, every temperature reading from its engines was turned into data. American scientists didn't just copy the German jet. They evolved it. They learned why its engines burned out after only a few hours of use, how its alloys were stretched to the limit, and how German mechanics had kept them flying with almost no resources left. The mistakes of desperation became the lessons of innovation. Rosener, meanwhile, was transferred to a prisoner-of-war camp in Texas. He was treated better than most, partly because of what he had brought with him. When questioned, he admitted that his flight path had gone wrong because of broken navigation equipment and the thick fog over northern Germany. "I saw a runway and thought it was home," he said during one interrogation. To his surprise, the Americans didn't hate him, they thanked him. One officer told him, "You may have done more to end this war than you'll ever know." For months, scientists continued to extract every secret from the captured jet. They shipped pieces to research centers and used them to train a generation of American engineers who would soon design supersonic aircraft and space rockets. The Me-262 was dissected, replicated, and reborn in new forms. It became the ancestor of the jet-powered world that would dominate the next century. Rosener was released in 1947, returning to a Germany divided and defeated. He found work as a mechanic, never speaking publicly about what had happened. To most people, he was just another veteran trying to survive. But in the archives of Wright Field, a note in an old intelligence report still bore his name beside a simple line, "Captured intact, March 1945, the first jet aircraft delivered by error." Historians would later trace how one wrong landing changed the pace of technology. Within 5 years, jet bombers filled American skies, and by the 1950s, fighters were breaking the sound barrier. Every one of them owed a small piece of their design to the jet that arrived by mistake. A moment of confusion had accelerated the future. One wrong airfield had reshaped aviation forever, proving that even in the chaos of war, history sometimes turns on the smallest errors. A single flight that ended in the right place for the wrong reason and gave America Hitler's secret jet. Years later, long after the war had ended and the jet age had begun, the story of Heinrich Rosener resurfaced quietly among aviation historians. By then, jetliners crossed oceans daily, and supersonic fighters guarded skies that once burned with propellers. Yet buried beneath decades of progress was the strange truth that one of the most important breakthroughs in aviation history had not come from victory, planning, or genius, but from a single terrified pilot landing on the wrong airfield. In 1953, when the first American F-86 Sabres screamed across the Korean sky, engineers who had once worked at Wright Field recognized the unmistakable echoes of the Me-262. The swept wings, the tricycle landing gear, even the cockpit ergonomics carried the ghost of German design. What Rosener's mistake had delivered to the Allies was not just a piece of machinery, but a glimpse into what human ambition could achieve under pressure. German engineers had built the Me-262 while cities burned